Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. Thomas Langley stepped into the diner, his heart pounding in his chest. The door let out a sharp creak as he pushed it open, the bell above the door ringing faintly as if welcoming him. The smell of greasy food and stale coffee immediately hit him, but he hardly noticed. He wasn't here for the food. He wasn't even sure what he was really here for. For years, Thomas had searched for his daughter, and for years, he had come up empty-handed. The loss of Emily had shattered him in ways he couldn't describe. A nightmarish flash of images still haunted him, her bright eyes, her shy smile, the way she'd clung to him when she was little, always so afraid to be apart. And then she was gone. 20 years. 20 years had passed, and the memories still felt so fresh. He had hired private investigators. He had gone to the police. He'd even spent weeks in strange cities, looking for any trace, any sign that she was alive. But each lead turned out to be false, each hope crumbled to dust. Emily had vanished without a trace, and all Thomas had were the few photographs of her as a young girl, and the ache in his heart that never stopped. But today, something was different. Today, something tugged at him, a feeling, a gut instinct. He couldn't explain it, but he knew. He had followed a hunch, an anonymous tip from a source he barely trusted, all the way to this rundown diner on the edge of town. The waitress behind the counter caught his eye. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, and had long, dark hair that was pulled back into a messy bun. She was moving quickly, refilling coffee mugs and serving plates of food to the few customers scattered across the room. Her hands were quick and precise, but there was a certain nervous energy about her as she went about her duties. It was her eyes. When they met his, everything else in the room seemed to blur, like the world had slowed down just for a moment. His breath caught in his throat. No. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But there was something about her. Something so familiar, like a reflection of the daughter he had lost. A long-forgotten instinct, a deep, parental ache that surged up from his chest, told him that this wasn't just any waitress. This was his daughter. He blinked, shaking his head as if to clear the thoughts racing through his mind. He had to be mistaken. After all these years, it couldn't be her. His daughter had been just a child when she disappeared. This woman was grown, far older than the little girl who had once been in his life. But her eyes. Those eyes. They were the same. The waitress, seemingly oblivious to his staring, turned away and went back to her work. Thomas took a few hesitant steps forward, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. His heartbeat thudded loudly in his chest. There were so many questions swirling in his mind. How could it be her? Why was she here, working in this diner? Why wasn't she living the life she deserved? Why hadn't she tried to reach out? His pulse quickened as he continued to watch her, and before he could stop himself, he found himself moving toward the counter. He reached the small metal table closest to the bar, where she stood, pouring coffee for an older man in a leather jacket. She didn't look up, but Thomas could see her hands tremble slightly as she worked. His mind raced, the swirling questions spinning faster and faster. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The waitress froze, then slowly turned to face him. Her face was neutral, but her eyes. Those eyes locked with his once more, and Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady, but there was something hidden beneath the surface. His breath caught again. This was it. This was the moment. There was no turning back now. His heart pounded, and for a second, he almost forgot how to speak. Are you Emily?" His voice cracked, and he hated how weak it sounded, but it didn't matter. The question had been asked. The young woman stared at him for a moment, the expression on her face unreadable. Then, just as quickly as the brief moment of recognition had passed, she looked away. She turned back to the counter, her movements stiff, as if she was trying to ignore him. Thomas's heart sank. He had been hoping for a reaction, something that would tell him he was right, that she was Emily, that his search was finally over. But instead, she acted as if he hadn't even spoken. "Is something wrong?" she asked flatly, as though she hadn't just seen the shock in his eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his mind racing. How was this possible? Could it really be her? The daughter he thought he had lost forever, the little girl he had spent his entire life trying to find, was standing right in front of him, yet she didn't even recognize him. Or worse, she didn't want to. He couldn't understand. He couldn't make sense of it. This woman, standing before him, couldn't possibly be Emily. It was impossible. But the more he looked at her, the more he couldn't deny it. There was a resemblance, a faint echo of the little girl he used to know. He saw the same shape to her face, the same way her eyebrows furrowed when she was nervous, the same slight curve of her lips that reminded him of when she used to smile. "Are you lost?" The waitress's voice brought him back to reality, and he realized that he had been staring at her without speaking for far too long. His mind spun. I'm sorry. You look so much like someone I once knew." Her eyes flickered with something unreadable, but before he could say another word, a loud crash came from the back of the kitchen. Plates and silverware clattered to the ground, followed by a string of curses. The waitress turned sharply toward the noise, and her face faltered for just a moment before she quickly composed herself. Without missing a beat, she grabbed a broom from behind the counter and began sweeping up the mess, all while still avoiding Thomas's gaze. As she worked, Thomas took another step closer, but his heart was racing faster now, the confusion eating away at him. He knew he had to find out the truth. He had to get her to talk, to tell him who she really was. But he also knew he was walking on a thin line. The last thing he wanted to do was push her away or make her feel threatened. "Is everything okay?" he asked softly, his voice laced with both uncertainty and desperation. The waitress didn't look up this time. She simply nodded. "Yeah, it's fine. I'll clean it up." He felt a pang of disappointment. The woman who could be his daughter was standing right in front of him, but he had no way of knowing for sure. No way of proving it. Thomas looked at the name tag on her apron. It read, Sarah. Sarah. It wasn't a name he recognized. And yet, there was something in her eyes, something that made him think she was hiding something. He had no proof, no way of making her admit the truth, but he could feel it deep down. This was his daughter. He was certain of it. He had to know why she was here. Why she hadn't tried to find him. What had happened all these years. But he didn't know how to start. He couldn't risk scaring her away. He had already lost her once. He couldn't bear to lose her again. Thomas sat down at one of the diner's worn-out booths, trying to steady his breath, his mind racing faster than he could comprehend. The waitress, Sarah, had avoided his gaze, acted as if nothing was amiss, and it had hurt more than he was willing to admit. The girl he thought was Emily, his daughter, the one he had searched for relentlessly all these years, had completely shut him out. But why? What had happened to her? What could have possibly caused her to end up in a place like this? She had always dreamed of something more. She had always been curious about the world beyond their little home. He remembered her bright eyes and the questions that never stopped coming. Where had that curious, joyful little girl gone? Thomas stared at the coffee cup on the table in front of him, his fingers lightly brushing the chipped rim. He knew he had to keep it together. The last thing he wanted was to push her away further, but everything inside him screamed to demand answers. Every part of him screamed to finally know why she had disappeared from his life all those years ago. What had made her vanish into thin air? The waitress, Sarah, came back to the counter, sweeping the last of the broken dishes into a dustpan. She worked quickly and quietly, like a woman who had learned to shut out the world. Thomas noticed that her movements were practiced, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. It was like she was trying to escape something, someone. His fingers tightened around the cup, and without thinking, he stood up. He was going to do it. He was going to ask her again. He needed to know, needed to understand. No more games. No more avoiding it. The past 20 years had been a lifetime of uncertainty, and he wasn't going to let it slip away again. He took a deep breath and walked towards the counter. Sarah, he said her name gently, as if he was testing it out. The moment the name left his lips, her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. It was as if she was trying to pretend he wasn't there, that he hadn't just called her out by a name that no one else knew. "Can we talk for a moment?" he asked, his voice quieter this time. He wanted to make sure he didn't sound demanding, but the urgency of the situation had a way of creeping in. She finally turned to him, her eyes narrowing, and for a split second, Thomas saw something flicker in her expression, something like recognition, or maybe even fear. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The blank mask of indifference returned. "I'm busy," she said flatly, returning to her work. "Please," Thomas insisted, stepping closer to the counter. His voice wavered with a mix of desperation and pleading, and it caught him off guard. He had never felt this vulnerable before, but in front of this woman, this stranger who could be his daughter, he felt completely powerless. "I just need to know if you're okay. If you're really..." "Emily," he whispered the last word, as if saying it aloud might make it true. Sarah's eyes flicked toward him, her gaze cold and distant. She didn't respond right away, but her fingers, which had been gripping the edge of the counter, tightened. Thomas knew she heard him, even if she wasn't ready to acknowledge it. He took a slow step back, giving her space, not wanting to crowd her. "You're wrong," she finally said, her voice trembling just slightly. She swallowed hard, and for the first time since he'd walked in, Thomas saw something human in her eyes. But the mask was still there, firm and unyielding. "I'm sorry," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But I'm not your daughter." Her words felt like a punch in the gut. For a moment, Thomas couldn't breathe. He had hoped for something, anything that might break through the wall she had put up, but instead, she had closed the door in his face. He tried to speak, but the words got caught in his throat. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't want to upset you. I need to know." But Sarah had already turned her back on him. She walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty diner. She was back to her duties, as if he didn't exist anymore. Thomas stood there for what felt like an eternity, his heart racing. His mind was in a whirlwind, the emotions swirling and crashing into one another. He had to do something. He couldn't just leave things like this. He couldn't leave without knowing the truth. He had already lost her once. He wasn't about to do it again. He glanced around the diner, taking in the shabby booths and cracked windows. There were only a few patrons left now, all of them wrapped in their own little worlds. It was quiet, too quiet. And yet, it felt like everything was happening in slow motion. His eyes drifted back to the kitchen, where Sarah had disappeared. Something didn't feel right. He couldn't explain it, but his gut told him that there was more to this than just a waitress trying to get away from a painful past. It wasn't just her response, it was the way she had looked at him when their eyes had locked earlier. It was like she knew exactly who he was, and yet she refused to acknowledge it. There was fear in her eyes, but it wasn't the kind of fear you saw in a victim or someone trying to protect themselves from a dangerous situation. It was the kind of fear you saw in someone who was trying to escape something they couldn't outrun. Thomas's mind raced. What had happened to her? What was she hiding? Suddenly, a thought struck him. She didn't know who he was, or she didn't want to. But if he was right, if she was indeed Emily, then he was going to have to find a way to prove it to her. There was no way he could leave now. Not like this. Not when everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped for, was so close to his grasp. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he had them. Hours later. The clock on the wall above the counter ticked steadily, its rhythmic ticking the only sound in the otherwise quiet diner. Sarah had retreated to the back again, and Thomas had remained in his seat, too afraid to leave, but too determined to give up. He didn't know what to do next. Should he confront her again? Should he tell her everything he had been through, the years of searching, the pain of not knowing? Would that be enough to make her understand? Would it be enough to make her believe him? He couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah, the woman in front of him, was not just a waitress. She was more. She was someone from his past. A past that he had buried deep inside him, a past filled with love, loss, and tragedy. Thomas stood up, moving toward the back of the diner. He had to know. He couldn't walk away again, not when the possibility of finding his daughter was so close. He had to find out who she really was. He had to break down the wall she had built between them, no matter what it took. As he walked toward the kitchen, he felt a mix of dread and determination. This could go one of two ways: either Sarah would finally admit the truth, or she would shut him out for good. Either way, he wasn't going to leave without getting the answers he needed. When he reached the kitchen door, he hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath. He knocked softly, the sound echoing through the empty space. "Sarah," he called gently. "I just want to talk." The door creaked open, and Sarah stepped out, her face pale, her expression guarded. She didn't say anything, but she didn't move away either. "Please," Thomas said, his voice softening. "I know you're scared, but I can help you. Whatever it is, I can help you." For a moment, she looked like she might say something. But then, she simply shook her head and turned away, her back to him once again. "I told you," she said quietly. "I'm not your daughter." But something in her voice cracked, just a little, and Thomas knew that the truth was buried deeper than either of them realized. The cold, sterile air of the diner did little to calm the storm raging inside Thomas. He stood there, rooted to the spot, as Sarah's words reverberated through his mind. "I'm not your daughter." For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined the entire thing. Could he have been so desperate for a reunion that he had convinced himself this woman, this waitress, was Emily? Could his mind be playing tricks on him, toying with his deepest desire? But no. No, it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was her. The eyes. The way she carried herself. The faint trace of a smile that looked so much like the one his daughter used to wear. Everything about her screamed that she was his daughter, Emily. He watched Sarah, her back turned to him once again as she wiped down the counter. She was trying so hard to appear unaffected, to continue with her work as though nothing was out of the ordinary. But Thomas knew better. She was hiding something. Something big. And he couldn't let it go. He couldn't walk away now. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, but he wasn't going to let fear stop him. He needed answers. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped his face, trying to calm the storm within. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Please. You don't have to hide it. You're my daughter, I know you are." She froze. For a second, it seemed as if the entire world had gone still. The clatter of plates, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the back, everything ceased to exist for that brief moment. Sarah didn't turn around immediately, but Thomas could see the slight tension in her shoulders. She was shaking, just a little. "I'm not your daughter," Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just go. You're mistaken. I'm not who you think I am." Thomas took a step closer. He had never felt more unsure of anything in his life, yet here he was, standing on the precipice of something that could change everything. "Why won't you tell me the truth?" His voice was calm, but inside, 1,000 emotions warred with each other: confusion, anger, desperation. Sarah's fingers clenched around the dishcloth in her hands, her knuckles turning white. "I can't. I can't do this," she muttered under her breath. She seemed so small, so fragile in that moment, and Thomas felt a sharp pang of sympathy. This wasn't just about him anymore. Whatever had happened to her, whatever pain she was hiding, it was far deeper than he could understand. "I don't know what happened to you, Sarah, but I need you to listen," he said, trying to make her understand. "I'm not just some stranger. I'm your father. I'm Thomas Langley. I've been searching for you for 20 years. And I know you're my daughter." A long, heavy silence passed between them. Sarah's body remained rigid as if bracing herself for something, anything, that might follow. Then, with a sudden movement, she turned and faced him. "I told you," she said, her voice raw and filled with emotion. "I'm not your daughter. You don't know me." Thomas's heart dropped, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. He had spent years mourning the loss of his daughter. He had spent sleepless nights wondering if she was alive or dead, imagining all the terrible things that could have happened to her. And now, standing before him, was someone who could have the answers he needed. He took another step forward, his voice softening. "I don't know who you are or what happened to you, but I can help you. I've spent years trying to find you. I just need you to tell me the truth." Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't go back. I can't go back to that life." Thomas's breath hitched. There was something in her tone, something so raw, so heartbreaking, that made him stop in his tracks. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, but he didn't know if that would be the right thing to do. "Sarah," he said gently, "I don't know what happened to you, but I want to understand. I want to know what happened, why you disappeared. Please, don't shut me out." She took a step back, her eyes wide, and for a moment, it seemed like she was considering something. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the back of the diner. Thomas hesitated for a moment, torn between following her and giving her space. But he had no choice. He had to follow. He stepped through the narrow doorway that led to the kitchen, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment he stepped inside, he saw Sarah standing near the sink, her back turned to him once again. She was staring at the floor, her shoulders shaking, and he could hear her soft, stifled sobs. "Sarah," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You don't understand. You're better off just leaving. It's better if you don't know." Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Something was terribly wrong. He didn't know what had happened, but he could feel the weight of her words. Whatever she was hiding, whatever she was running from, it was consuming her. And he couldn't let her go on carrying this burden alone. "Tell me," he pleaded. "Please, Sarah. Tell me what happened." She slowly turned to face him, her face pale and tear-streaked. For a moment, she didn't speak, and the silence between them was deafening. Then, in a voice barely audible, she said, "I can't be your daughter because I'm not Emily. I'm someone else." Thomas felt as though the ground had just shifted beneath him. "What do you mean?" His voice was barely a whisper. Sarah's shoulders sagged, and she let out a long, shuddering breath. "I was never Emily. I don't even know who she is." Her words were a sharp contrast to the image of the young girl he had carried in his heart for years. "Then who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. Sarah's eyes met his, and for the first time, Thomas saw the depth of pain and fear in them. "I was adopted when I was very young," she whispered. "My real name isn't Emily. It's Sarah, but I wasn't supposed to know. I wasn't supposed to find out. And now, you've come here and and everything is falling apart. Thomas's mind spun. What was she saying? You were adopted? But why would you think you were Emily? Why would you? Because it was easier, Sarah interrupted, her voice cracking. It was easier to believe I was Emily. I had to believe it. You were my last hope. I needed to believe you were my father. Thomas's heart twisted with pain. The realization hit him hard. She had been living with a lie, the weight of an identity that wasn't her own. But why? Why hadn't anyone told her the truth? Why had she been kept in the dark all these years? Who are you really, then? Thomas asked, his voice trembling with emotion. I don't know, Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. I don't know who I am anymore. Thomas stepped closer, his heart aching for this young woman, lost and broken, desperately trying to hold on to something that didn't belong to her. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer her comfort, but he didn't know where to start. I'm so sorry, he whispered, the words filled with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. I had no idea. Sarah's eyes softened, but there was still so much fear in them. It's not your fault. But now that you know, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. Thomas reached out, his hand hovering in the air as if he were unsure whether she would allow him to touch her. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. You're not alone, he said softly. I'm here now. And we're going to figure this out. Together. The dim lights of the kitchen seemed to flicker as Sarah stood there, her back pressed against the sink, tears still silently streaming down her face. Thomas couldn't bring himself to move closer, though every part of him wanted to. He had been waiting for this moment for so long, but now that the truth was finally coming to light, it didn't feel like the relief he had expected. It felt heavier. A burden that neither of them had been prepared to carry. He couldn't fathom it. He had spent 20 years searching for his daughter, convinced that he had found her at last. But now, here was Sarah, this woman he had believed was Emily, his long-lost daughter, telling him she wasn't. Telling him she had been living with an identity that wasn't hers. That she was someone else entirely. Yet, there was no denying the truth that was now unfolding before him. Sarah was not Emily. But somewhere deep inside, Thomas still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was letting on. I don't understand, Thomas said softly, his voice trembling as the weight of the revelation sank in. Why did you think you were Emily? Why would you want to believe that? Sarah sniffed and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she seemed so small, so lost. Because that's all I had. I had no other family. I didn't know who I was. My whole life, I was told I was adopted, but nobody told me the truth. No one told me who my real family was. Her voice cracked as she spoke. I've always felt like I was a mistake. A forgotten child. And then when you showed up, something inside me. I don't know. I just thought maybe this was the chance I had to be part of something. To have a family. To have a father who actually cared about me. Thomas felt his heart breaking for her. He had never imagined that she had been living with so much pain, so much uncertainty. For years, he had mourned Emily, wondering what had happened to her. But he never once thought about the pain someone else might have endured in her place. Sarah wasn't just a stranger. She was a person who had been left alone, her entire life shaped by questions about her identity, her past, and her place in the world. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Thomas asked, his voice soft but edged with pain. Why did you keep pretending to be Emily? Sarah shook her head, her eyes avoiding his. Because I didn't know what else to do, she whispered. I wanted to believe I was someone else. I wanted to believe I wasn't just a mistake. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I saw how wrong it was. And the harder it became to tell you the truth. Every time you called me Emily, it felt like a part of me was dying inside. But at the same time, it was the only way I could feel like I mattered. Like I had a place in the world. Thomas felt a knot form in his throat. He couldn't imagine the pain Sarah had been living with all these years. The grief of losing her family, the confusion about her identity, the desperation to belong to something, to someone. It hit him hard, the realization that she had been caught in a lie not just for his sake, but for her own survival. "You matter," Thomas said softly, his voice filled with a tenderness he hadn't expected. "You matter to me. And I'm here now. I want to help you, Sarah. I want to find out who you really are. Together." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, it was as though she didn't believe what he was saying. She blinked a few times, clearly struggling with her emotions. She had been taught her whole life to fend for herself, to survive on her own. Trusting someone wasn't easy. Letting someone in wasn't easy. And after so many years of hiding behind a false identity, it was going to be even harder to face the truth. "I don't know where to start," she whispered. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't even know where to begin to find out the truth." Thomas took a deep breath and stepped closer, careful not to overwhelm her. He didn't want to scare her off, but he had to do something. He couldn't just let her drift into uncertainty again. He had to help her find herself, to reclaim the parts of her that had been lost in the years of searching for a family she hadn't known she had. "We start with what we know," Thomas said firmly. "We'll take it step by step. Together." Sarah nodded slowly, still uncertain, but the look in her eyes told Thomas she was beginning to believe him. Slowly, a flicker of hope ignited in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. A new search begins. Over the next few days, Thomas and Sarah spent hours together in the diner after hours, piecing together whatever information they could find. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sarah had a handful of documents from when she had been placed in foster care, birth certificates, medical records, and some adoption papers, but nothing that could directly lead them to her biological parents. Thomas had made a few calls, trying to get any leads on adoption records or agencies that might hold information on Sarah's past, but it was like chasing shadows. The system had a way of protecting people, of keeping things hidden. And while that was meant to protect the privacy of children in foster care, it also made it nearly impossible for someone like Sarah to find the answers she so desperately needed. Still, every evening they spent together, huddled in a corner booth of the diner, felt like a step toward something. Toward healing. Toward understanding. Toward the truth. Sarah had stopped denying what was happening. She had stopped pretending that she was someone she wasn't. And for the first time in years, Thomas saw a glimpse of the girl she might have been if things had been different, if she hadn't been forced to grow up without a family, without a sense of identity. But as the days passed, something else began to stir. As they went through Sarah's records, Thomas found a clue that stopped him in his tracks. A name. It was written in the corner of an adoption document, barely visible, but unmistakable. Maggie Klein. It was just a name. Just a simple name. But it was the first lead they had found that connected Sarah to someone. Thomas felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by a sense of dread. What if this was another dead end? What if they were chasing ghosts again, only to come up empty-handed? "I have to follow this," Thomas said, staring at the name written on the paper. Sarah looked at the name, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Maggie Klein? Who's that?" "I don't know," Thomas said, shaking his head. "But it's the first real lead we've gotten. It could be the key to finding out who you really are." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes distant as she thought about the possibility. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What if it's too much? What if I'm not ready for the truth?" Thomas reached out and placed a hand on hers, offering what little comfort he could. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm here. We're in this together, okay? Sarah gave him a small, uncertain smile. Okay. The meeting. The next morning, Thomas made the call. Maggie Klein, it turned out, had worked for an adoption agency that specialized in matching children with families. She had been involved in Sarah's adoption, though the details were vague. But Maggie was alive. She was living just an hour outside of town, and Thomas had set up a meeting. He wasn't sure what they would find, but he knew they had to try. As Thomas and Sarah drove to Maggie's house, the tension in the car was palpable. Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped the door handle. She was nervous, afraid of what she might learn. Thomas couldn't blame her. After everything she had been through, the thought of facing the truth was terrifying. They arrived at Maggie Klein's house, a small, modest home with a well-tended garden out front. The doorbell rang, and when Maggie opened the door, Thomas could see the years of life etched into her face. She was older than he had imagined, but there was something familiar about her, the way she looked at them, the way her eyes softened when she saw Sarah. "Are you Maggie Klein?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but nervous. "Yes, I am," Maggie replied, her voice warm yet cautious. She looked over at Sarah, then back to Thomas. "What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for answers," Thomas said, his voice firm. "This is Sarah. She was adopted through your agency years ago, and we're trying to find out who she really is." Maggie's eyes widened, and she took a step back. "You're Sarah?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My God. I never thought you would come looking for me." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "I don't know what's real anymore," she whispered. "I don't even know who I am." Maggie looked at Sarah, then back at Thomas. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a quiet, shaky voice, she spoke. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time." The door to Maggie Klein's house creaked as it opened further, and the silence that followed was both unnerving and heavy. Sarah felt her heart racing in her chest, a strange mix of fear and anticipation gnawing at her. Standing there, staring at the woman who might hold the key to her past, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if she was ready for whatever came next. Maggie Klein looked at her for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something deep in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or regret. It felt as though she were seeing Sarah for the first time in years, though Sarah could see the hesitation there, the uncertainty in Maggie's demeanor. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Sarah opened her mouth, as if to speak, but no words came out. Her hands were trembling, and she could feel the lump in her throat growing, threatening to choke her. The weight of the moment was pressing down on her, and she could hardly breathe. Thomas, sensing her discomfort, placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it grounded her. He had been a steady presence in the last few days, his unwavering support giving her the strength to keep going, even when she felt like turning back. Maggie cleared her throat, taking a step back, and gestured for them to come inside. "Please," she said softly, "come in." The living room was cozy, furnished with mismatched chairs and a low coffee table covered in old magazines. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air, and despite the initial tension, there was an undeniable warmth to the space. It felt welcoming, like a refuge, but it also held the weight of the past, of years of silence, of stories untold. Thomas and Sarah entered the room and sat down on the couch, and Maggie closed the door behind them before sitting in the armchair opposite them. For a moment, no one spoke. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the house settling. Sarah could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her mind racing, but she forced herself to sit still. She couldn't allow herself to break down now, not when she was so close to the truth. Finally, Maggie broke the silence. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice tinged with a sadness Sarah couldn't quite place. "I've known this day would come for a long time." Sarah's eyes widened. "You've been waiting for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maggie nodded. Yes. I've always known you'd want to know the truth. And I knew it wouldn't be easy. But you deserve to know, Sarah. You deserve to understand where you came from. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had never realized how badly she had needed to hear those words. For so long, she had felt like she didn't belong anywhere, like she was a fragment of someone else's life, stuck in an endless loop of confusion and doubt. And now, here she was, sitting in a room with the person who had the answers. You were just a baby when you came into my care, Maggie continued, her voice soft but steady. You were placed in foster care when you were only a few days old. I don't know the full details of what happened before that. But I do know that your biological mother wanted to keep you, but circumstances didn't allow it. There were complications. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Complications? What kind of complications? Maggie hesitated, her gaze shifting away, as if the weight of the words she was about to say was too much. I'm afraid your mother wasn't in the best place at the time. There were personal struggles. She wasn't able to care for you, and the decision was made to place you for adoption. Sarah's stomach churned. She had always wondered why her mother hadn't kept her. Why she had ended up in foster care, bounced from one family to another. The emptiness she had always felt was starting to make sense, but the realization didn't make it any easier. It was as if the puzzle pieces were finally fitting together, but the picture they formed was one she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. My biological mother, Sarah trailed off, not sure if she even wanted to hear the rest. What happened to her? Maggie's eyes softened, and she glanced away as if the question pained her. I don't know. I don't have any information about her whereabouts after she gave you up for adoption. I was only involved in placing you with your adoptive family, but it wasn't long before your adoptive parents moved out of state. I never got the chance to follow up. I was told that your family was wonderful, and I assumed you'd be happy. Sarah nodded slowly, her thoughts a whirlwind. This was more than she had ever known about her past. It wasn't the reunion she had imagined. She had spent years fantasizing about finding her biological mother, wondering if she was alive, hoping for some sort of connection. But now, she realized the truth was far more complicated than she had expected. Is there anything else you can tell me about her? Sarah asked, her voice quiet. Anything at all? Maggie hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. I don't have any more details about her life. But I do know that she loved you. She wanted to keep you, but it wasn't possible. There were people involved who made the decision for her, and it wasn't something she could fight. Sarah's mind was racing. She could hardly process the information. But why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Maggie's face tightened, and she sighed deeply. Because it wasn't my place. You were given a new identity, a new chance at life. Your adoptive parents were wonderful people, and they gave you everything you needed. They loved you. They protected you. I couldn't interfere with that. I didn't want to risk the life you had built. For a long time, there was only silence. Sarah's thoughts were too tangled, too overwhelming to put into words. Everything was happening so fast, everything she had believed, everything she had been told, was being called into question. I don't know if I can do this, Sarah whispered. I don't know if I can handle knowing that everything I believed was a lie. Thomas, who had been silently watching the exchange, leaned forward and spoke softly. Sarah, it's not about the past anymore. It's about you. You're not alone. I'm here. We can figure this out together. Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude and fear. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the past didn't define her. Maybe she could rebuild. Maybe she could find a new way to live, free from the uncertainty that had consumed her for so long. I'm here, Thomas repeated, his voice unwavering. We'll find out what happened. We'll find out who you really are. Maggie nodded in agreement, her expression softening. You don't have to go through this alone, Sarah. You've come so far already. You've already taken the first step. The rest will come with time. The long road ahead. As the conversation drew to a close, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The answers had opened more doors, but they had also created new questions. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least now she had a starting point. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't facing it alone. Thomas drove her back to the diner, the setting sun casting long shadows over the quiet streets. Sarah stared out of the window, lost in thought. There were still so many things she didn't understand, so many pieces of her past that didn't fit. But there was also something she hadn't felt in years, something like peace. The truth, however difficult, was no longer a stranger to her. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could finally begin to heal. They had a long road ahead, and Sarah wasn't sure where it would lead, but she wasn't afraid to face it anymore. With Thomas by her side, she knew that no matter what the truth was, she could handle it. For the first time in a long time, she believed that. The days following their meeting with Maggie Klein were a blur. Sarah couldn't quite process everything she had learned. The information Maggie had given her, the confirmation that she wasn't Emily, the realization that her biological mother had once wanted to keep her but couldn't, it was all a lot to take in. And yet, as Thomas had said, they would face it together. The truth felt like a heavy weight. It was both freeing and suffocating at the same time. Sarah had spent so long longing for the answers, but now that they were finally here, she didn't know how to make sense of them. She didn't know who she was anymore. The person she had been before felt like a distant memory. She was someone caught between two identities, two worlds. She spent the next few weeks meeting with Thomas almost every day. They continued to dig deeper, trying to find any additional information that could help Sarah piece together the puzzle of her past. But each step forward was met with another roadblock. Adoption records were sealed, and the information Maggie had provided about her birth mother was minimal at best. But they didn't give up. They couldn't. They had come too far to stop now. The next step. One chilly autumn afternoon. Sarah sat in the diner, staring at the coffee cup in front of her. The usual clinking sounds of the kitchen and the soft hum of the diner's small crowd filled the air. But it felt like all of it was miles away. She was lost in her own thoughts, reflecting on how far she had come in the past few weeks. Thomas was sitting across from her, his eyes fixed on a file in front of him. They had just come from another meeting with an adoption agency, another dead end. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "Maybe we're approaching this the wrong way. We've been chasing after pieces of paper, adoption records, birth certificates, documents. But we've never actually spoken to the people who knew your mother." Sarah's gaze lifted to meet his. She hadn't thought of that. All this time, she had been so focused on the official records, trying to find the truth through legal channels. But the truth might be found in the people who had actually known her mother. "I think you're right," she said quietly. "But who do we talk to? I don't even know where to start. I don't even know who she was. Maybe we start with the people who were closest to her. Friends, family members, anyone who might have known her." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes serious. "We don't know how much time we have. If she's alive, we need to find her before it's too late. If she's not, we need to find answers. For your peace of mind, for closure." Sarah nodded slowly, her stomach twisting. "I don't know if I'm ready to meet her. I don't know if I'm ready to hear what happened." Thomas reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. "You don't have to do this alone. And you don't have to face anything you're not ready for. But this is your chance to find the truth, Sarah. You owe it to yourself. You owe it to that little girl inside of you who's been waiting for answers." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked down at their intertwined hands. She had always been afraid of the truth, afraid of what it might reveal. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running from it. "Let's do it," she said, her voice steady. "Let's find out who I really am." The search begins. Thomas and Sarah spent the next few days tracking down people who might have known Sarah's birth mother. It wasn't easy. Many people had moved on with their lives, and the few who might have remembered her mother were either untraceable or unwilling to speak. But just when Sarah was beginning to lose hope, they received an unexpected phone call. A woman named Ellen Roberts, who had once worked with Sarah's biological mother, had contacted them. Ellen had heard about Sarah's search and had agreed to meet. She had said she was willing to share everything she knew. The meeting with Ellen. Ellen's house was modest, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The front yard was tidy, with flowers still in bloom despite the cold weather. Sarah could feel her heart beating faster as they walked up the path to the door. When Ellen answered, she smiled warmly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. She welcomed them inside, and after some small talk, they sat down in the living room. Ellen looked at Sarah with a mixture of sympathy and nostalgia. "I've been waiting for you," she said quietly. "I didn't know how long it would take for you to find me. But I'm glad you did." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. "You knew my mother?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ellen nodded, her expression softening. "Yes. I knew her very well. We worked together for several years. She was a good woman, Sarah. She was trying to get her life together, trying to make things work, but it wasn't easy for her. The circumstances were difficult." "Where is she now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to her?" Ellen's face grew solemn, and she sighed deeply. "Your mother, she struggled with a lot of things. There were personal demons she couldn't overcome. She loved you, Sarah. She wanted to keep you. But it wasn't safe for you to stay with her. She was in a really bad place at the time. There were people in her life who made decisions for her, and it wasn't her choice to give you up." Sarah's chest tightened. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but they were incomplete. "What do you mean? Who made those decisions? What happened to her?" Ellen paused for a long time, clearly weighing her words carefully. "She was in an abusive relationship. The father of your sibling, your older brother, wasn't a good man. He was involved with people who were dangerous. Your mother tried to protect you from him, from all of it. But in the end, it was too much. They made her give you up. She had no choice." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "My brother? I have a brother?" Ellen nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Yes, you do. He's older than you. But after your mother gave you up, she disappeared. No one knew where she went. I never heard from her again." "Where is my brother?" Sarah asked urgently. "Do you know where he is?" Ellen shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I wish I could tell you. But after everything fell apart, your mother went off the grid. I lost contact with her, and I've never heard from her since." Sarah's mind reeled with the new information. She had a brother. A sibling who had grown up without her, just as she had grown up without him. And her mother, she had wanted to keep her. She had loved her. But everything had been taken from her. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Sarah asked, the pain in her voice unmistakable. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Ellen looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I wanted to tell you. But I couldn't. The people who were involved in your mother's situation, they made sure she stayed silent. They made sure that no one could find her, that no one could find you. I didn't want to risk your safety. I didn't want to bring you into something dangerous." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the words settle in her heart. It was so much to process, too much to understand all at once. But one thing was clear, her mother had loved her. And Sarah had never known that. A new beginning. As Sarah and Thomas left Ellen's house, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. She had learned more in the past few days than she had in the last 20 years. She had learned that she wasn't just a lost child, abandoned and forgotten. She had a mother who had fought to keep her, a sibling she had never known, and a story that was hers to tell. But there was still so much to uncover. Her mother's disappearance, her brother's whereabouts, the truth about the dangerous people involved, it was a lot to take in. Yet, for the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she was on the right path. As they drove back to the diner, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the road. Sarah looked out the window, her thoughts racing, but there was one thing she knew for certain: this was only the beginning. The truth, as painful as it was, had finally started to come to light. And now, Sarah was ready to take control of her own story.